So welcome everyone to the episode 9 of Philosopher Meets Critics, a session that is organized by the Federal University of Bahia and Concept, the Cologne Center for Contemporary Epistemology and the Kantian Tradition. So we're back from our summer break, some of you may have noticed, and we're ready to continue with our roundtable discussion. And today we're very happy to present J. Adam Carter from the University of Glasgow. Adam's research mainly focuses on epistemology and with a specialization on virtue, social, and extended epistemology. And today, Adam will present his new book, Autonomous Knowledge, Radical Enhancement, Autonomy, and the Future of Knowing. It is a brand new book and it will be published by Oxford University Press in the beginning of 2022, in February actually. And today again, we have invited two critics and we're very happy to present Professor Nikolaj Jang Linding Pedersen from the Underwood International College at the Yonsei University. Welcome. Duncan Pritchard from the University of California in Irvine, and later on, Gloria Andrada from the University of California in Los Angeles will join us. So thank you everyone for taking your time. I think we will start off with a short presentation by Adam. So Adam, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Sybil. And thanks to Concept and thanks, Waldo, for organizing this. I'm really grateful, and thanks also to the commentators for reading a draft of the book and giving me some feedback. I really appreciate it. So I'm going to try to give an overview of some of the book's aims, and I'm going to try to do this in a way that's sort of accessible to folks who maybe haven't done a lot of epistemology before and who might be interested about what the book's about. So in short, epistemologists all the time think about these weird cases. They just throw around things like brain chips and all sorts of stuff, gizmos, and people have been doing this since about the 90s when this true temp case came out. The idea of the true temp case is, imagine if you had sort of a thermometer just stuck in your head and you didn't even realize this. And whenever anybody asks you what the temperature is, you sort of just say 21 degrees. You have no idea why, but it's perfectly reliable because the thermometer that's stuck in your head is just causing you to form these accurate beliefs. Epistemologists have already thought about that case, plenty. But the thing is, it was always sort of just a sci-fi case, and a sci-fi in like a real fictional sense. The thought is that, okay, we've made up this example, we can think about what we'd say about it and sort of move on, but this is really far-fetched stuff. Well, the thing is, it's not that far-fetched anymore. And this book was sort of motivated by appreciating that already, so folks like Elon Musk over at Neuralink are developing brain-computer interfaces. There's already examples of rudimentary belief inception in mice. Obviously, ethical approval stands in the way of many tests on humans in the near future, but the thought is that it's probably just a matter of time before cases like true temp become reality. And sort of the underlying motivation for the book is that wouldn't it be a good idea to try to figure out what the heck epistemologists should try to say about certain kinds of, not just true temp, but many different kind of futuristic high-tech enhancement variations and twists on true temp style cases before these technologies are here. And so that was sort of what got me interested in trying to think about what if we just fast forward 500 years in the future, what kind of technologies might we have, sort of based on what kind of technologies we have now, and how might, predicated on the idea that the restrictions we have now on how we represent the world, if there aren't such restrictions in the deep future, what would our epistemological theories have to do? How would they have to be different? So having given some thought about this, one of the key ideas that I considered, and this was sort of based on rewatching, this is sort of timely now because they're making a new version of The Matrix. Some of you might have seen this, but the old Matrix movie, when Neo sort of lies back in a chair and all of a sudden, his head plugged into some electrode says, I know Kung Fu. And thought experiments like that got me thinking that it seems important to sort of theorize about the way in which even reliable, so that's obviously, that's a case of know-how, right? But belief and knowledge insertion, is this even conceptually coherent? And the more I started thinking about this, the more the idea of epistemic autonomy started coming to the fore. And in particular, I started thinking about how some of our beliefs, right, are in a certain pre-theoretically obvious sense autonomous, and certain kinds of beliefs which are sort of compelled presumably aren't. Are the compelled beliefs candidates for knowledge? Well, that's difficult to answer, because not a lot of epistemologists have yet sort of tried to grapple with the question of in what sense knowledge requires that our beliefs be autonomous. Is there a sense in which beliefs must be autonomous in order to be known? So delving into that question sort of was the starting point for the book. And I ended up with a theory that sort of broadly gives autonomy conditions on both propositional knowledge and on know-how. And so that's sort of the fruit of the book, is meant to be new conditions on knowing that are meant to handle not just cases in the next 5-10 years as we develop technology further, but meant to handle cases that are much more sophisticated in the distant future. So it's meant to be kind of a future-proof epistemology now by thinking clearly about the sense in which knowledge, both of know that and know how, require autonomy. So that's the overall objective. I'll mention a little bit now about what I did in some of the main chapters. So there's just 5 chapters. And the first chapter, I set out just to give various twists and tweaks on the true temp case. There's a lot of talk of true temp in chapter 1. And a lesson that I try to draw from that case is that simply trying to rule out certain kinds of cases that are even more sophisticated than that case, where the enhancements are remarkable and they can do even more than what true temp's enhancement did. Maybe they can give you not just the belief, but also your reasons, cause you to base the belief on the reasons, maybe integrate the belief within your other beliefs or something like that. Imagine really sophisticated technologies. The more we think about what potential technologies could possibly do, the more it seems like simply trying to develop a justification condition on knowledge that can sort of rule out such cases is not going to work. Sort of a lesson drawn from the first chapter is that it's really not in the job description of a justification condition on knowledge to be able to do that kind of lifting when it comes to ruling out more and more sophisticated kinds of cases where everything seems to be all right epistemically, but it looks like your belief just isn't autonomous. And so the idea is that at the end of chapter 1, as I try to motivate the idea that knowledge is not merely justified true belief. We already know that because of Gettier, but rather that knowledge isn't just, propositional knowledge isn't just a matter of having a belief that is true and which passes certain standards of epistemic scrutiny. But in addition to these things, a belief needs to be suitably autonomous in the way that knowledge requires. Of course, it would be nice if you could sort of have a justification condition on knowledge or other epistemic conditions that sort of smuggle in all you need to do to have an autonomy condition on knowledge that seems to work. But as I suggest, you can't do that. So one of the main arguments in chapter 1 is to suggest that these are actually logically independent conditions. The satisfaction of one condition doesn't entail the satisfaction of the other condition. So thus the idea that we should transition from a JTB, justified true belief plus X template, to a JTAB plus X template, where an autonomy condition on knowledge is logically dependent from these other conditions. Obviously, some readers at this point might think, why are you playing this silly Gettier game? Haven't we, or Gettier game? Why are you trying to give a reductive analysis of knowledge? Isn't this old-fashioned? Hasn't Timothy Williamson taught us that knowledge can't be analyzed in terms of constituent parts? Is it a mistake to try to add another condition? This is a failed research program, et cetera. 2 responses to that. Maybe so, maybe not. So when a lot of the motivations for knowledge first epistemology, start around 2000, a lot of the best and most elegant virtue theoretic accounts of knowledge actually were put forward after that. There's anti-luck virtue epistemology. There's there's Sosa-style virtue epistemology, there's Greco-style virtue epistemology. None of these have 15 conditions. These are much more elegant, and the potential promise of such views suggests that the idea that we could give a reductive analysis of knowledge isn't so far-fetched. That being said, I don't want to hang my hat on this. And so I have an appendix to chapter 1, which says, even if you don't think that we could analyze knowledge in terms of constituent components, including autonomous belief condition and other components, the idea that knowledge requires autonomous belief is also applicable for knowledge firsters, for folks who go in with Williamson's idea that knowledge isn't analyzable in terms of constituent parts. So I added that appendix just in case, to show that the project has applicability even for those who think that we should abandon the idea of giving an analysis of knowledge. So that takes us to chapter 2. At this point, you might think, well, okay, knowledge requires autonomous belief. Satisfying an autonomy condition isn't going to be ensured by just having a justified belief or satisfying other epistemic conditions. So what the heck does satisfying an autonomous belief condition on knowledge require of a thinker? And chapter 2 tries to envision 2 broad types of answers to this question. One, an internalist answer, and the other, an externalist answer. So the internalist kind of answer to this, which is obviously modeled off of internalism as approach to justified belief, the internalist says, okay, the type of epistemic autonomy of a belief that matters for knowledge is entirely a function of a subject's present mental structure. So no difference in epistemic autonomy of a belief without some difference in the present mental structure of one's beliefs. This is an internalist view about knowledge-relevant epistemic autonomy of a belief. That doesn't work, I say. So I give some cases and I suggest that that can't be right. There are counterexamples to this. We shouldn't be an internalist about how to theorize about the epistemic autonomy condition on knowledge. The property that a belief must have, if it's to be known, a property it has just in case it's suitably autonomous. Internalism doesn't work. That leaves externalism. So maybe the autonomy that a belief must have in order to be known isn't just a function of the subject's present mental structure, right? That's just the denial of internalism about epistemic autonomy. But what kind of externalism works? Here I was making some analogies to the moral responsibility literature on attitudinal autonomy of the sort that's relevant for moral responsibility. And I imagine sort of epistemic tweaks on some of these moves in the moral responsibility literature to sort of envision what externalist accounts of knowledge relevant epistemic autonomy of a belief would look like. One type of externalist view that I think doesn't work is a kind of counterfactual externalism. And you find this kind of move in the moral responsibility literature. The idea would be whether your belief is autonomous in the way that matters for knowledge is a matter of, on this type of a view, whether you would endorse that belief as your own if you, or as to borrow like more strictly, would you not feel alienated from that belief if you had full information to the causal history of the belief? That's counterfactual externalism. And that doesn't work, or so I argue. I'm not going to go into the details here, but I suggest that actually doesn't work. There are various cases that show that internalism doesn't work, and if you're going to be an externalist, this kind of counterfactual externalism doesn't work either. So what I go for is a view that is sort of modeled off of some stuff that Al Mealy does in the moral responsibility literature, which is to defend what is called a history-sensitive externalist account of the kind of autonomy of a belief that matters for knowledge. Now, for Mealy, actually, I apologize. I'm actually not sure how to pronounce his name. I think I've heard that it's Mealy, so I'm going to go with that. What Mealy thinks is that the kind of autonomy of attitudes that matters for moral responsibility is a matter entirely of the history of the belief, right? It's not a matter of what you would feel about it right now if you had a full backstory to the belief, and it's not a matter of what the internalist would say. It's not just a matter of what your present mental structure is. Rather, whether one's belief is autonomous in the way that matters for knowledge is entirely a matter of whether 2 things happened in that belief's history. Whether one, the way that you acquired that belief bypassed in a certain way the exercise of any of your cognitive faculties. So that's one condition, a bypass condition. The other is an unsheddability condition. So we can ask separately from the question of whether or not the way you formed the belief bypassed the exercise of any of your cognitive faculties. Notice that happens to true temp, right? The insertion of the thermometer sort of leads him to form beliefs in a way that bypass the exercise of any of his cognitive faculties. Separately from this, we can ask the question of whether a given belief is unsheddable, which is to say, when a belief that you form, is formed such that the way you produce it bypasses the exercise of any of your cognitive faculties, is it unsheddable for you? Do you continue to hold that belief even in the face of evidence that would suggest otherwise? If yes, then now you've satisfied both the bypass and the unsheddability conditions. And on the kind of history-sensitive externalism that I go in for, the thought is your belief is not epistemically autonomous in the way that knowledge requires if the belief both bypasses any exercise of any of your cognitive faculties and it issues in a belief that is unsheddable for you. Now, the details are a little bit more complicated than that in the book, but that's the key idea. And that's what I go in for chapter 2. So I give a substantive account, right, an externalist account of the kind of attitudinal autonomy, the kind of autonomy of beliefs that knowledge requires. Chapter 3 then goes on to discuss defeat. So I think if knowledge has this new condition, right, this autonomous belief condition, that there's a separate condition, the thought is that perhaps knowledge can now be defeated in new ways, right? Ways that target the satisfaction of that condition, in particular, by targeting your beliefs about whether or not that condition is satisfied. So I envision in chapter 3, 2 new kinds of defeaters that we have to sort of grapple with in the theory of knowledge that sort of come onto the scene if you grant me what I've done so far in chapters 1 and 2 and have defended a particular type of externalist new condition on knowledge, which is an autonomous belief condition. If you grant me that stuff, I argue in chapter 3, there are 2 new types of, I don't know if this is the right way to call it. I call it heteronymous defeaters. So type 1 and type 2 heteronymous defeaters, which roughly track kind of rebutting and undercutting modes of defeat. So I introduced these 2 types of defeaters in chapter 3, and this is a suggestion that our epistemology can be updated in ways that are useful by appreciating the sense in which knowledge is autonomous. Knowledge must be autonomous. By appreciating that, we see new ways that it can be defeated. Chapter 4, and I'm nearly approaching the end of this summary. Saibal, I told you this would be 10 minutes. I've probably already gone longer than that. Chapter 4 makes a complete transition. I move over to one of my favorite topics, which is know-how. And the thought is this, okay, so to this point, I've argued that there's an autonomous belief condition on propositional knowledge, the satisfaction of which isn't logically entailed by satisfying a justified belief condition. This already has one implication for the way we think about know-how. If know-how is as an intellectualist about know-how would have it, then my knowing how to ride a bike is a matter of effectively of propositional knowledge, right? As Jason Stanley and Tim Williamson think, right? It's a matter of knowing of some way for me to ride a bike, that is a way for me to ride a bike. Now, stepping back for a moment, since this is a type of propositional knowledge, it looks like what I've said so far, right? That knowledge requires autonomous belief, propositional knowledge requires autonomous belief. It's going to kind of carry over mutatis mutandis to knowledge how if the intellectualist is right and know-how is just a matter of know that. However, I don't think the intellectualist is right. So in some of my previous work, actually some of my work with Duncan, we've in a series of papers argued that intellectualism isn't right, that know-how and know that come apart in various kinds of cases. So I'm an anti-intellectualist. I think that broadly in the spirit of Gilbert Ryle, I think that know-how is more fundamentally a matter of possessing and exercising abilities or competences than it is in knowing facts. That's kind of a crude distinction, but that's a rough way to characterize what the intellectualist is all about. Know-how is more fundamentally a matter of ability, possession, and exercise. That being said, interesting cases that are sort of analogous to the cases we ask about, brain chips that help you come to have propositional knowledge better. some types of cases like this also allow us to ask a very similar question in the case of know-how. So take performance enhancing drugs, right? Take performance enhancement technologies. Obviously right now, Lance Armstrong might use, I can't remember exactly what he used. He used some kind of I think, hormone that allowed him to pedal straight up the Alps or whatever. This was of course illegal, right, in the competitions that he was in. But stepping back from issues of legality, we can ask whether or not, if the assistance one gets from the latest medicine and technology is significant enough, does one still count as possessing the ability, right? Or is the ability, and if it's drug derived or technology derived in a certain way, is one's disposition to perform successfully no longer an ability that sort of lines up with know-how? This is, as I see it, a structurally analogous to question as we're asking about sort of true temp style cases, but it's a question we ask about know-how. In chapter 4, what I tried to do is I tried to defend a very specific kind of autonomy condition on anti-intellectualist know-how that's fundamentally a matter of ability. And it is not the same kind of condition that really just applies to propositional knowledge. That was my history-sensitive externalism. I wish that I could simply take my history-sensitive externalism that I used for giving an autonomous belief condition on propositional knowledge and just sort of use it to give me a sort of an autonomy condition on anti-intellectualist know-how. But belief and propositional attitudes are just fundamentally different, and the account doesn't work. So I had to develop a new account in chapter 4, one that relies on recent work in the moral responsibility literature on ideas to do with guidance control. So I develop a sort of a guidance control theory of how it is that our know-how has to be autonomous in a certain way. So you can fail to have know-how by failing to satisfy a certain autonomy condition on possessing and exercising one's dispositions to succeed reliably enough. So that was the goal in chapter 4. I believe Gloria mentioned she's going to press me on some issues to do with know-how in chapter 4. So I'm looking forward to that. In chapter 5, which I know Nikolaj is going to engage with, chapter 5 returns to an old question that I've worked on and thought about for a long time. It's a hard question, which is effectively the value problem for knowledge. So it's widely thought that knowledge is more valuable than mere true opinion, and that a theory of the nature of knowledge has to be sort of at least logically consistent with the idea that knowledge is something that is more prized in some way than, true beliefs that are justified that just sort of fall short. Well, here's what I sort of think about, a gauntlet that I've sort of laid down for myself that I have to deal with. And that's what I tried to do in chapter 5, which is this. If, as I've claimed, knowledge requires more than just justified true belief plus X, where X is some epistemic condition, but it also requires A, right? It also requires the satisfaction of an autonomy condition, then it darn well better be that satisfying that autonomy condition somehow adds value to an otherwise known but heteronymous true belief. And if it doesn't do that, then it looks like my own view would sort of fail, sort of an autonomy twist on the value problem. So I need to explain why satisfying that A condition adds some additional boost of value to an otherwise known but non-autonomous belief. And that's what I tried to do. And along the way, I sort of draw from some different strategies, show how they didn't work. I end up engaging quite a bit with a really cool paper by Kurt Sylvan in mind called Veritism Unswamped. And I imagined a version of some moves that he makes in that paper, how that might work. And I end up with a new type of line about how it is ultimately that I think that autonomy adds value to an unknown true belief, otherwise unknown true belief. But I know Nikolaj got some comments on that. So I'm not sure how long I just talked in that introduction, but I will leave it there, and I look forward to hearing your comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam. So welcome, Gloria. We're all waiting and very happy to see you. And I think, yeah, if you don't mind, you can just start and give the first comment.
Okay, thank you. And sorry for my mistake, but I was ready, so I will start my presentation. Okay, so I'm going to begin. First of all, thank you for the organizers of this symposium, and thank you for inviting me. I want to also congratulate Adam on this book. It's been a very, very fun and stimulating read, and I strongly recommend it to anybody interested in epistemology and anybody interested in seeing how epistemology can contribute to some of the challenges that we currently face. And it's gonna keep me thinking for a long time. So just to say congratulations, Adam, on this book. So as Adam announced on his presentation, I'm gonna comment on chapter 4, the chapter that is devoted to knowledge how, performance enhancement, and guidance control. And in particular, Adam, as I will proceed to say, suggests that an autonomy condition on an anti-intellectualist construal of knowledge how relies on the notion, or he proposes that it relies on the notion of guidance control, and this notion of guidance control has two sub-conditions. One is that the mechanism needs to be reasons responsive, and the other one is that the mechanism needs to be owned by the agent. I'm gonna say a few things on each sub-condition. I want to say that I'm not gonna put forward strong objections. I'm gonna press a little bit each of the conditions. I have found Adam's account very compelling, but I'm interested in seeing how he replies to some of the points that I'm gonna raise, so that he can explore his own account a bit further. So guidance control tells us roughly the following. So one is in a state of knowing how to something, let's say phi, only if one has the skill to phi successfully with guidance control, and one's thing exhibits guidance control, and furthermore manifests know-how only if one's thing is caused by a reasons responsive mechanism that one owns. So those are the two sub-conditions to guidance control. One of the stimulating and wonderful thought experiments that Adam Carter offers to us in this chapter is the following. So Mr. Magnucomb. The case says to us the following. Mr. Magnucomb has a special brain-computer interface chip implanted in his head that regularly causes him to play with perfect reliability the Rossolimo-Sicilian defense in chess when there's an opportunity to do so. But when he plays it, he has no idea why he makes the moves he does. So the question is the following. Does Mr. Magnucomb know how to do the Rossolimo-Sicilian? And the answer, if we take the previous definition of guidance control, is that he does not know, given that the mechanism in virtue of which he does the Rossolimo-Sicilian is not reasons responsive and is not owned by Mr. Magnucomb. So I'm going to explore what does Adams entail by each of these conditions. So let's begin by saying something with respect to the reasons responsive mechanism. The idea, as we have just seen, is that an agent has guidance control over an action only if that action is caused by a reasons responsive mechanism. And how do we know that a mechanism is reasons responsive? Well, the idea is that a mechanism, which is surely a way to do something, is reasons responsive if, holding fixed that mechanism, the agent would presumably choose and act differently in a range of scenarios in which they are presented with good reasons to do so. So the idea basically is that if we change the normative landscape, we change the reasons that the agent has to act the way that they are going to act. If we hold fixed that mechanism, they would not act in that way. And if by changing the normative landscape, the agent nevertheless acts the way they do, then that mechanism is not reasons responsive. So in the example concerning Mr. Magnucomb, the idea is the following. So we hold fixed the mechanism, that is the mechanism in virtue of which Mr. Magnucomb performs or does the Rossolimo-Sicilian. But we change the reasons that Mr. Magnucomb has for playing the Rossolimo-Sicilian. For instance, he does not want to make this move when his opponent is X instead of Y. Then if the mechanism would be reason responsive, we have to assume that Mr. Magnucomb would act differently. And the idea is that if his mechanism does not have that kind of flexibility, then Mr. Magnucomb does not know how to play or how to do the Rosolimo Sicilia. Okay, so I want to ask Adam, what does he think about the following case? So in this case, it's a case of an enhanced or not enhanced condition. So Sarah is, at least in the way of attaching a new technology. So Sarah is learning to play tennis. She has done a fairly good job at it and is becoming more and more fluent with the forehand ground stroke. This explains why in the tournaments that she has started to play and that she always wants to win, she always tries to use this move. However, today she has found out that she's playing against Paul, who is famous for responding very aggressively to the forehand ground stroke, but very badly to other types of stroke. And Sarah would really like to hit the ball differently, but when the opportunity comes, she ends up hitting the ball with a forehand stroke. So my question is, does Sarah know how to hit a forehand stroke? I think that if the parallelism holds with Mr. Magnucomb, it seems that we would have to claim that she does not, precisely in virtue of the fact that her mechanism is not reasons responsive. And my worry is that the condition might be too strong and that it does not contemplate the different stages in skill acquisition. And I'm looking forward to hear what Adam has to say in this respect, because to me, at least, Sarah does know how to make a forehand ground stroke. And her mechanism exhibits only a certain degree of reasons responsiveness, precisely because of the fact that, oh, did you lose my presentation? Okay. Precisely because of the fact that she's learning. So I was wondering whether we could think of reason responsiveness as something that is open, or that can be open to a certain variation of degree. So you can have a mechanism that is reason responsiveness to a certain degree, and I agree on that there has to be a degree of flexibility in the mechanism for us to attribute knowledge how to someone, but there could be different degrees of reason responsiveness, and experts would be the ones capable of more and more cognitive flexibility. This is my main comment on the reason responsive mechanism. Let me now contemplate the mechanism ownership. So mechanism ownership is defined as follows. After a very thorough and interesting exploration, I'm going to simply sum up what it adds up to. So one owns a mechanism just in case one reasonably takes herself to be the agential source of the outcomes S of that mechanism, and two, one reasonably takes herself to be a fair target of the reactive attitudes, for instance, approval, praise, disapprobation, blame regarding S, and three, where 1 and 2 are reasonable only if one can place the reliability of her relevant mechanism giving rise to S in a competent perspective from which she can see how her way of bringing about S is a reliable way of bringing it about. I want to focus in that last bit in how do we account, how that Carter's approach accounts for this perspective. And if I get it right, and this is something that I'm looking forward to hear what Adam Carter has to say in this respect. The idea, he accounts of this perspective in terms of having a conception of the reliability of the mechanism. And one of the problems is that in cases of radical enhancements, the cost of incorporating the enhancement the cost is that one loses precisely any conception of how the mechanism's inclusion contributes to that action. So in some cases, even if the mechanism, we can imagine that is reasons responsive, if one does not have such conception of how it contributes to the reliability of that action, then it's not owned by the agent. Therefore, one cannot manifest know-how in virtue of exercising it. This process of mechanism ownership Adam considers it a higher order process. One of the problems, again, is that this condition might be too strong, and Carter notices this and considers this problem in this chapter, given the fact that intuitively these conditions would leave out children that, for instance, children that intuitively know how to do many things, precisely given the fact that they do not have such conception regarding their mechanisms or ways to do something. So the price of ruling out cases of enhancement is that we rule out also intuitive cases of a knowledge house. So for instance, cases where children know how to do things, but they lack such, in this case, concerning the mechanism ownership, they lack such conception. They lack that perspective regarding their own mechanisms or ways to do something. And to solve this problem, Carter relies on what he calls a Pritchard style solution, drawing on how Pritchard treats cognitive integration and extended cognition and extended knowledge, and argues that the autonomy condition specifically targets cases where an agent's cognitive architecture has changed dramatically, for instance, enhancement. And in cases of innate abilities or even innate enhancements, the conditions could be relaxed. And I want to explore a little bit how could they be relaxed and what grounds this proposal, the idea that depending on whether there are innate or radical enhancements, the conditions could change. These are just the quotes where these ideas are presented. I'm not gonna read them. And I want to propose some thoughts, some ideas, a suggestion, according to which I want to explore what if the problem is not that the ownership condition is too strong for cases of, let's call, unenhanced or innate knowledge how, for instance, because of the fact that it's too demanding for children. But what if the problem has to do with how do we unpack the ownership condition, this idea of having a conception or a perspective over the reliability or the contribution of our own mechanisms. And I'd like to suggest that whether radical enhancement requires stronger conditions compared to innate mechanisms depend actually on how we fill in the details. So it's not all a matter of these dramatic changes, but on how we build the details of how would these radical enhancement cases work. So in what follows, and I'm going to be brief, I'm going to explore the ownership condition in enhanced, or what I'm calling unenhanced cases. So first of all, I was thinking that one of the reasons why we would want to relax the conditions for innate mechanisms is that we normally, or assume, maybe I'm taking it wrong, I'm looking forward to hear what you, Adam, has to say in this respect, that one might argue that the ownership condition for innate mechanisms should be relaxed, given that an innate mechanism or an early enhancement is owned by the agent in virtue of subpersonal or automatic processes. That is why having a conception is not necessary, and it might not even be feasible because children lack that level of cognitive sophistication. However, when we think about radical enhancement, for instance, of the case of Mr. Magnucomb, or in the film Matrix Neo, that has an implant and instantly learns or knows how to do Kung Fu, this kind of radical enhancement, normally we imagine them as happening drastically, all at once, for instance, an implant or a new piece of software. And in those cases, it might seem to us that the only way of owning that mechanism is by grasping or understanding its contribution. So we have a tension between innate mechanisms and a subpersonal form of ownership, and the idea of instant radical enhancement, and the fact that owning, grasping their contribution would be, it seems like the only way to own them immediately after this dramatic change in our cognitive architecture. But I want to suggest that there are other options available. Very briefly, so developmentally, we have to learn how to do things with our own bodies and our own innate or biological abilities, and we do so mainly by exploring and interacting with the environment. And ownership, even in the case of innate abilities, is the result of practice. So it's not all a matter of subpersonal ownership. And I don't know if Adam has considered this, but in the literature, sometimes the result of these integrating processes has been articulated in terms of monitoring mechanisms that give rise to metacognitive feelings. For instance, the feeling of familiarity, the feeling of flow while performing an action. And these sort of feelings can inform us when a given mechanism is unreliable, therefore stopping us from relying on them. This can be a form of ownership. And in this respect, what is interesting is that it is still a form of second order process, but the way we unpack this conception or this perspective is less intellectualistic, like is a less intellectualistic form of articulating this perspective or this conception. And in this sense, it can be the case that children and even non-human animals exhibit this kind of ownership condition. Now, when we bring this idea to a radical enhancement, and remember that one of I think that an important thing is that we are thinking of this radical enhancement as happening instantly. If we think about this, we bring this idea of learning a skill and owning our own body, we realize that we undergo less radical changes constantly in life as we learn new skills and as our bodies and environment changes. And after undergoing a radical enhancement, the agent, it's true, they need to update and calibrate their skills, but this process is really similar to what happens in all of our learning acquisition processes. It's more of a continuum rather than something that requires a much more demanding condition. So I want to suggest that even in the case of radical enhancements, owning that mechanism is also the result of practice. And the crucial thing is that depending on different details concerning the enhancement, for instance, how and to what extent the enhancement is connected to other parts of the agent's existing cognitive architecture, whether, for instance, there are social practices regarding the use of that enhancement, we have to take all of those things in consideration in order to explain whether that the ownership process would be more or less demanding for the agent. So it's not a matter of radical enhancement necessarily requiring these strong conditions, but it depends on how we feel in the details. So what matters, it seems that there must be some monitoring of the mechanism in place to the extent that if the mechanism is not working, the agent should act accordingly. But for instance, if the mechanism is instantly connected to other bits of cognitive architecture, there are social practices surrounding the use, ownership might be less demanding for the agent, even in this case of a radical change in cognitive architecture. So as I just say, I want to simply explore the possibility that the ownership condition might be more or less demanding depending on different factors concerning the agent's cognitive profile and the characteristics of the implant of the enhancement, but both innate mechanisms and radical enhancements undergo such process. I also wanted to leave this question out whether Adam, you would think that there could be something like degrees of ownership. Perhaps there are different degrees of ownership, and in some cases, grasping or understanding the contribution can reflect or taken to be an indicator of high levels of ownership and expertise, but it's not the only one. And for knowing how to do something, insofar as there is this monitoring in place, it could be enough for owning a mechanism, and that's it. So this is simply a sum up of my contribution, but given that I've spoken for a little bit more than the time that was allotted to me, I'm gonna leave it here, and I want to thank you for listening, and thanks Adam for this stimulating piece. So I will stop here.
Thank you, Gloria. Okay. Yes, and I guess, Adam, you want to respond, right?
Yes, I just want to first thank Gloria for really insightful comments. You've you've pressed me on 2 points of that chapter that I had personally felt a little bit uneasy about and struggled with. And I'm glad that you identified both the issues that you did. Also, I'm really pleased that it looks like you construed what I was up to very charitably, and that you got what I was up to in that chapter exactly right, at least by my own lights, what I was attempting to do. I'm going to talk about 2 of the points that you raised in these short comments. First off, I'm going to talk about your Sarah case. Right. So your Sarah case is, as I take it, it's kind of sort of pressing the idea that maybe this reasons responsiveness, right, component of guidance control. If I put this as part of my view, it looks like perhaps this condition is so strong that it would imply that a lot of ordinary people don't satisfy it. A lot of people who know how to do things, like Sarah in this case, right, don't satisfy reasons responsiveness. Because Sarah, on your case, right, hits a forehand, but it's not the case that Sarah would alter the way she performs the forehand if in the presence of strong reasons to do so. She's still going to do it. However, intuitively, it seems as though, Sarah still knows how to hit a forehand. But if that's right, then it looks like sort of the underlying idea behind reasons responsiveness as a condition on know-how that I'm putting forward is too strong. So I'm sympathetic with that to some. I see the pull of the case, and I'm really sympathetic to the move that you sort of suggested in response to that, which is that reasons responsiveness, one can be more or less reasons responsive, right? You could have a complete automaton case where you're going to imagine a person, Sarah Starr, who Sarah Starr does everything exactly the same, only moves her arm exactly the same way, no matter where she is on the tennis courts, and no matter what's going on around her, regardless of whether there's even a ball there, just always make the same movement. When Sarah Starr, right, hits the forehand, this isn't a manifestation of know-how. The reasons responsiveness condition clearly fails, but there are intermediate cases where it seems like on some descriptions of what her shot is to some degree not reasons responsive, but we still want to attribute know-how. I think that what you suggested at the end of that example is just spot on, which is that right, as an anti-intellectualist, at least, there's no reason, I think, that we shouldn't suggest that know-how is something that's going to come by degrees. Perhaps it's going to be sensitive to the extent to which one's way of doing the relevant thing is reasons responsive. Now, that being said, I mean, there are some intellectualists like Carlotta Pavesi who think that just suggesting that know-how is gradable, right, doesn't necessarily count against the intellectualist. Even if that's right, the thought is that at least for an anti-intellectualist, there's no obvious reason why know-how couldn't to some extent come to degrees. And if that's right, then I think spelling out in a little bit more detail how I think of the reasons responsiveness condition as being a gradient condition would be a good idea that would improve the proposal. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. As for the second point, gosh, I rewrote that part probably 5 or 6 times, all bothered by how I wanted to go to deal with the fact that it looks like my conditions, right, my autonomy conditions on anti-intellectualist know-how, on a straightforward reading of them, it looks like they're going to just be too strong because they're going to rule out young kids, right? Young kids who don't satisfy the ownership condition because it looks like they're not forming any beliefs about the reliability of the way they're doing the relevant thing. But that's bad news if your theory of what know-how requires is going to have a condition on it that implies that kids don't know how to do things. So that's bad, and I don't want that. So that's the way I moved. That's why I transitioned to a move that I always found compelling. It's as you noted, it's at the end of Duncan's 2010 paper, where he's describing like these variations on tempo and tempo star and tempo star star. And when he's discussing this, he makes a point that I think sounds exactly right, which is that in some circumstances, right, it seems like and he's describing this, of course, in the case of extended cognition and propositional knowledge. He thinks that it seems like we might relax the condition that he puts on extended knowledge, which is that you have to sort of endorse the way that you form the relevant belief is reliable. He thinks that gets relaxed in certain cases, and particularly when innateness is one consideration that can be a relaxing factor, right? We relax these requirements if, someone comes innately fitted with the relevant gear. I always thought that sounded right to me, and that's why I thought that was the right move to make here, which is to suggest that satisfying these conditions, mechanism ownership and guidance control, these definitely need to be satisfied in case in which you're sort of incorporating a new gizmo into your architecture that is helping you have like an extended ability, but that we could potentially relax it in the innate case. That being said, you now point out that that perhaps there might be a more elegant way to approach this, which is not to simply relax the condition framed in the strong way that I have it in the innate case, but to rather describe what has to happen for ownership in a more inclusive way, such that folks, even in the unenhanced cases, might satisfy them, such that maybe even kids might satisfy them. What a cool idea. So I considered actually going this route. And I had a little bit of difficulty figuring out how to get it to work. So in particular, the thought would be time, right? And this is something from the end of that paper of Duncan's that I thought was kind of plausible, which is that if someone is fitted with a gadget that helps in this case with know-how, over time they kind of develop a track record. They kind of calibrate it with their environment. And it seems like after they've been using the gizmo for long enough, we sort of then kind of have an intuition to sort of relax some of these conditions that they would need to satisfy, perhaps right at the very beginning, right when they're fitted with the enhancement. Now it might be that if there is some sort of subpersonal, and I know you alluded to this, like some personal analog to endorsement that would do the relevant work, then I wouldn't need to relax conditions. I could just specify a weaker version of the endorsement condition. I think the way that I would want to go, and I'm really glad that you've raised this point, is that what I think I'd want to go is I'd want to suggest that make a minor tweak probably to my view. It's a little bit late for this, it's in print now, but this is what I would do if I had a little extra time. I would argue that the endorsement component, which I take to be a necessary condition for ownership, I would describe that as a sufficient condition, I think, on reflection, and then consider that there might be other independent sufficient conditions for satisfying ownership. And that could include maybe establishing a track record over time, even if one doesn't consciously endorse the reliability of the gadget. So in the short of it, well, not really short, the short of it is, I think that based on the kind of reasons you consider, I think that what I described is very plausible as a sufficient condition, but it might be that there are also other independent sufficient conditions that could do the same work that don't require conscious endorsement. And if that's right, then potentially I wouldn't need to actually have sort of two sets of standards, one's for enhanced cases and one's for innate cases. But those are my initial thoughts, and you've really got me thinking about that chapter, and I think you pressed me on just the right spot. So thank you so much for your awesome comments.
Thanks to you, Adam.
Thank you. And we will continue right away. Duncan, would you go next?
Sure. So thanks. I'll share screen. Just give me a moment. Thanks very much to the organizers, Waldo and Sybil and Concept for organizing this. Everyone can see the slides. Yeah, let me just move this out of the way. Okay. this should be about 10 minutes. So let me just say that I like the Adam's book immensely. I think it's an excellent book, an important book actually. A lot of the issues are things that you know, have been sort of live in the literature for some time, but I think Adam adds a really interesting new twist on these debates. I mean, the basic background to this is that, as Adam points out, we're facing this future, possibly a near future. I guess I think it's not quite as near that as Adam thinks. I've sort of changed my mind on this, but certainly it's a possible future that looks more possibly actual as days go by, where our beliefs will be generated. I've got this inverted commas for reasons apparent by technology, so that's extended cognition, broadly speaking. And the question is, when do these beliefs amount to knowledge? That's extended epistemology, broadly speaking. And Adam's twist on this, and I'm just going to focus on propositional knowledge. I think the ability knowledge stuff is very interesting, but I'll leave that to others. In fact, Gloria's already covered a lot of this in her comments. His twist is that we really need to recognize that standards accounts of propositional knowledge are missing a crucial ingredient, which is the autonomy of belief. And he has an account of what the true condition must look like and what consequences it might have. I agree with that. I mean, I agree with most of what Adam says here, but it struck me that if I were writing, you know, I suppose I had this, I had Adam's idea and I were pursuing it, I would have structured it differently. So let me just say how I would have put it, because it's by way of critique, if that's the right word. That is, I would have reframed this at the level of belief. That is, it seems to me, and this is kind of something I've become more convinced about as years go by, that belief is really the joker in the pack, often in epistemological discussion. We treat it as if it's just this notion that we have a handle on. And yet I think actually there's lots of things going on when we talk about belief. And that if we were to be more specific about what we mean when we talk about this propositional attitude, then a lot of the debates that we're engaged in would start to become a lot clearer. And I think this is one of those debates, actually. So it's not that I think Adam's wrong. It's just I think the way he pitches it as that belief plus the autonomy condition plus the epistemic conditions is actually, I would suggest, the wrong way to think about this. I think the autonomy condition should be already in the notion of belief, at least as belief is applicable in the case of knowledge. So let me say a little bit about what I mean by that. All the artwork, by the way, is futurism in tribute to the futuristic nature of the book. So I think we need to distinguish between the folk notion of belief versus what I call chaos belief. So that's the kind of notion of belief that we're interested in as epistemologists, the kind of propositional attitude that figures in as a constituent part of knowing. The folk notion of belief, it seems to me, I mean, just listen to how it's used. It's incredibly broad. And some people have written on this. Leslie Stevenson has a paper a few years ago about this, and various other people have commented on this fact. There's a whole range of distinct propositional attitudes which get covered by the folk conception of belief. I'm going to give you some examples in a moment, but things, you know, faith gets described as belief. What philosophers call acceptance gets described as belief. I think a lot of presuppositional commitments get described as belief in ordinary parlance. I think even brainwashing, you know, gets described as belief. And I think in a lot of these cases, we wouldn't be at all tempted to think of them as being the propositional attitude as having the properties of chaos belief. That is, I think chaos belief has certain distinctive features. For example, this is an exhaustive list, by the way, and I'm not going to comment on which of these, if any of these properties are sort of primary or which are secondary. I think there probably are a class of primary qualities from which the secondary qualities emerge, derivative qualities, if you like. So for example, I think chaos belief involves a genuine commitment to the truth, and by that I mean agnosticism excluding. So a lot of propositional attitudes which get described as belief are compatible with agnosticism about the truth of the target proposition. Acceptance, for example, is like that. A lot of presupposition is like that. I think chaos belief needn't correspond to what the agent sincerely asserts. It's a sort of deeper level attribution to the agent, so it can come apart from sincere assertions of that kind. It's reasons responsive, and by that I don't mean that it's rational. Obviously, chaos beliefs can be irrational, but that it has a certain base level responsiveness to rational considerations. So, in particular, a propositional attitude that wasn't reasons responsive at all simply wouldn't count as a chaos believing. But I think it can count, depending on what kind of propositional attitude it is, it can count in the folk sense. And indeed, I think there are lots of propositional attitudes which we treat as belief in the folk sense, which aren't reasons responsive. I think it's a personal rather than a subpersonal property. Some people talk about beliefs as subpersonal properties of the agent. Well, maybe, but in the folk sense perhaps, but not in the KAP sense. Related to this, I think it has a certain level of integration within the subject's noetic structure. I don't think KAP beliefs just pop into the head in the way that ordinary beliefs do. I'll get back to this. That there is this notion of KAP belief and that it has these properties, I think explains why epistemologists make certain claims about beliefs, which if they were talking about the folk notion would just simply be bizarre. So epistemologists say things like, belief has a telos, the telos of truth. Well, sure, I think that sounds right, it's KAP belief. The folk notion of belief, well, sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Some epistemologists argue that the mere fact that you believe that P can be a reason for thinking P is true. I think in the KAP sense that has some plausibility. I mean, I can make sense of it and personally endorse it. But if the folk notion doesn't strike me as at all plausible. For example, another thing epistemologists say is that one can't in full awareness endorse inconsistent propositions. I know that's controversial, obviously, but that has an air of plausibility, but only if you're talking about KAP belief. I don't think the folk notion is quite happy with inconsistent beliefs. Actually, we attribute inconsistent beliefs to people, even in full awareness, to agents all the time. So I think there's a range of cases here. I won't go through all these. I mean, I think if you listen out to how the folk notion is used, you'll find cases where it gets used in all of these types. Faith, for example, I don't think in its core manifestation doesn't have the right kind of reasons responsiveness that we find in KAP belief, but we do talk about religious faith in terms of belief. Certain kinds of wishful thinking get captured as belief, but again, there's the wrong kind of reasons responsiveness, acceptance too. We attribute explicitly inconsistent beliefs to subjects in the folk sense. I don't think in the KAP sense. Brainwashing. I mean, the other thing I've written about is primitive hinge certainty. I think there is this Wittgensteinian hinge certainty, which is more resembles faith actually than it does than KAP belief. It certainly doesn't have the right kind of reasons responsiveness, even though it is an all-out commitment to the proposition. And of course, some of these states are compatible with agnosticism, like acceptance and so forth. Now, here's the significance of these points. I would suggest that once we start to differentiate between belief, the folk notion, and KAP belief, then it becomes plausible that KAP belief already incorporates an autonomy requirement. It already incorporates exactly what Adam means. And if that's right, then we don't need to think of the autonomy requirement as being an additional requirement on belief. Rather, what we need to do is to have a more fine-grained account of the notion of belief as it appears in an account of knowledge, KAP belief, and then spell out the sense in which that demands autonomy. I mean, basically what I'm saying is a lot of these cases that epistemologists give, where they just, glibly talk about beliefs being, inserted, blah, 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 like the original Temp case, but also a lot of these extended cognition cases. Well, I think we should look a bit more closely there. Maybe in a folk sense, belief is arising, but I'm not sure it's clear that KAP belief is arising. Basically, I want to suggest that a propositional attitude wouldn't count as a KAP belief unless it was a reasons-responsive commitment to the truth of P that was in some, at least minimal sense, appropriately integrated within the subject's cognitive architecture. And I think that will give you what you need for autonomy. And I think it also explains why KAP beliefs can't simply be inserted, quote unquote. I put generated before in inverted commas. This is why I think there is a sense in which you can generate KAP beliefs through technology, but it's not like through, plugging things into people's brains or something like that. That's not quite how it works. It's more downstream than that. So let's think about what Adam says about beliefs. This isn't, I say roughly, it's very roughly because Adam adds lots of tweaks to this and clarifies it in lots of different ways, but it would take me more time than I have to go into all the twists and turns. So very roughly, there's these two conditions. I think these are the Almeli conditions or variations thereof that Adam gives for autonomous belief. The beliefs have to be sheddable in the sense that it's possible to lower one's confidence in them in response to rational considerations. Well, reasons responsiveness, as I'm understanding it, would give you that, right? They have to be acquired in a way that does not bypass the subject's cognitive faculties. again, I think the kind of integration that I'm talking about is the minimal integration required within for the belief to be integrated within the subject's noetic structure, I think would give you that too. So I think once we start to think about what's involved in chaotic beliefs, we would think that it already involves some kind of autonomy condition. Mere belief, the folk notion, isn't going to demand that. So the moral then would be, is to make that distinction, is that as epistemologists, what we're really interested in, this more specific notion of belief, brings with it autonomy. And I think we find this, I mean, this isn't, it's in, the oddity is in Adam's cases. Sorry, the gardeners have just started work outside. I apologize for the noise. It's not just in Adam's cases, but in lots of different cases that epistemologists use, where they talk about beliefs being inserted. I mean, some of Adam's cases, in fact, some of them I think are perhaps problematic even on the folk notions. There's one case Adam has where all of a subject's beliefs could be due to extended cognitive processes. I'm not sure that even works in the folk sense, but certainly in the K-app sense, I don't think we would think of these as K-app beliefs at all, or where a completely external process immediately integrates an extended belief into the subject's cognitive architecture. I don't think that's possible. It's possible with the folk notion. I don't think it's possible with the K-app notion. So I think that's what's going on here, right? I think we need to distinguish between the two notions. Two more things I wanted to say here. One an aside, Adam also says that a few places the values can be inserted into the subject, through these extended processes. And I don't think values work that way either. So I'm not going to go into this today, but I think values are more like stable long-term features of an agent or something like that, in the sense that you couldn't just simply engineer values just by plugging something into that. I mean, you can plug something in which further downstream might lead to a change in values. And you can plug something into a subject which might get them to act as if they have different values or something like that. And then that's granted. But I think that's a bit like the distinction in belief and K-out belief. In order to do this with values, you've got to, somewhere further downstream, there's got to be some kind of integration at the personal level with the subject. Otherwise, it's not going to count as a change in their values at all. And just going back to the tempo case. So, Adam discusses that. He mentioned it just a moment ago. It came up in the discussion. This is the case I give of where we imagine some temperature tracking device fitted from birth. And I realize now that that's actually perhaps misleadingly described, because I describe it as a case of extended cognition. Extended cognition is belief generating. But of course, I don't think babies have beliefs at all in any sense, right? I mean, newborns, neonates. So it doesn't start off as an extended cognitive process. It's just something that's fitted, which over time then becomes an extended cognitive process. So it results in beliefs in the folk sense. But then I was thinking of it then in time still, I realize now, it takes even more time still for it to result in K-out beliefs. So there's going to be some further gradations of integration before it even gets to the point where the subject is in a position to gain knowledge from this extended cognitive process. So yeah, that's kind of how I'm thinking about these cases. I think it's a little different to how they're being thought of in the literature. And then one final point I wanted to make, which relates to this stuff about epistemic value. So Adam claims, this is quite an interesting claim. He says that the autonomous belief condition on knowledge isn't entailed by any of the other conditions on knowledge. Now, of course, if what I've just said is right, then in a sense, it is kind of trivially entailed because we're talking about knowledge. So insofar as we're talking about knowledge, we're going to be talking about propositional attitude, which is going to be apt for knowing. So we're talking about chaotic belief. But even if we bracket that thought, it's not clear to me that the argument goes through. So what Adam does is he considers a bunch of epistemic conditions, and he argues in each of these cases that they don't entail the autonomous belief condition. And I think his argument's still there, they all work. But of course, that style of argument where you could consider particular instances of view and then infer the general claim is always a little bit hostage to fortune, because maybe there's another epistemic condition you didn't consider. And I think that's exactly what's going on here. I think all the epistemic conditions considered don't look to me to be plausible as accounts of knowledge, i.e. you couldn't just plug them with true belief into a view and have an account of knowledge. But when you plug something in which does look plausible, So like my view, the anti-Locke or anti-risk virtue epistemology, but actually I think other views as well. I think Sousa style views, Greco style views, Zexy style views would have the same effect. I think you do start to have a condition where it looks very plausible to me that you would get a chaos believing, thereby an autonomous believing coming out of it. So, for example, in my view, the safety of one's true belief, of one's cognitive success, has to be significantly credible, attributable to one's manifestation of relevant cognitive agency. It's very hard to see how you could satisfy that without an autonomous believing, a chaos believing in the relevant sense. But what would it be? The safety of your true belief is credible to your agency, but that your believing is somehow disconnected from your agency in the relevant sense. So I think actually, on plausible theories of knowledge, the entailment to the chaos belief is is doubly made, right? It's made both in virtue of thinking about what kind of propositional attitude knowledge demands, but also in terms of thinking about what kinds of epistemic conditions on knowledge are plausible as part of a theory of knowledge. And I think that has a bearing on what Adam says about the value problem, because remember, for him, there's a new value problem, which is how to explain what's better about autonomous knowledge as opposed to non-autonomous belief that meets the epistemic conditions for knowledge. But I think if you go down this route, if you frame the debate the way I'm suggesting, then that distinction doesn't emerge, right? And that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Duncan. Yes, and now it's your turn again, Adam.
Thank you, Duncan. Those are super helpful comments. Let's see where to. One place I might start is to think about the fact that there could be. I can see completely, by the way, the idea that there's this full conception of belief that, we use belief to refer to all sorts of stuff, and this doesn't track the kind of belief that's in the market for knowledge. I completely agree with that. One thing I'm not sure about, and this pretty much comes down to where you, at least I think, whether you buy one of the cases that I use in chapter 1 or not. On your list of sort of folk uses of belief that don't track what you take to be chaos belief, you include, like, guessing, wishful thinking, this stuff. You've also got compelled belief, and what was the first one on that list? Something that hit brainwashed.
Brainwashing,
yeah. So I grant you that all the others aren't K-apt, but I wonder about the first two. All right, so I wonder whether or not the kind of state that you're in, right? And of course, the way I'm thinking about things, you've got belief, and then belief could either be autonomous in the way that matters for knowledge, or it might not be. Your way of thinking about this is look, knowledge-apt beliefs, which aren't going to include these compelled beliefs, and they're not going to include these brainwashed beliefs, right? Knowledge-apt beliefs are going to have these special markers in virtue of which the autonomy of belief is kind of caked into the idea of a K-apt belief. And that includes reasons responsiveness, you said, and integration, I think, was the second one you said. Here's where I wonder. Now, I've flip-flopped a little bit on this myself. I ended up on the Andy Clark side of it. So there was a time when I would have thought that auto-integration doesn't even make any sense, right? The idea that some high-tech futuristic enhancement, and I discussed this with Andy back when I was in Edinburgh, and I was thinking, how could what he says even be possible? So he described, and he was actually, I think, challenging a view of yours at the time. He was thinking, what if if you stick a chip in, your view is, look, this takes a long time to cognitively integrate. It doesn't just happen with the snap of a finger. And I think Andy is thinking, well, it depends on what the technology could do. Like neuromodulation is a complicated thing. Technology could become more and more sophisticated. So if we fast forward far enough, the thought would be perhaps even such things as integration, where it, as you say, like connected with the noetic structure, maybe this really is just a snap in the finger in the future. Of course, you could say that's really, really improbable. That would take the fanciest technology, but I'm thinking of, dealing with, possible cases here. If you grant that it's possible, then the thought is that, well, it's not obvious that excluding, that you couldn't even conceivably have a sort of attitude that's in the market for knowledge that is sort of implanted or compelled, because it depends on the technology. Now, I don't know. I mean, this really gets tricky, because maybe I'm just so far off in the woods thinking about, well, Carter, what are you going 5,000 years in the future or what? I'm not sure. Perhaps I am. But that's if you grant me that a chip could be auto-integrated, basically, then my thought is that, okay, my cases are up and running and you need an autonomous belief condition. It's not going to be baked into this idea of k-apt. But I concede to you that it's difficult to think about this kind of a thing. And I can see the pull in the other direction to think that, like you suggest, look, maybe it's just constitutive of what integration is, that it takes time. And if that's right, then that puts pressure on that type of case.
I mean, I think what's interesting, particularly talking to someone like Andy, is that there's a real decision point here. I mean, the way I'm not sure Andy thinks that beliefs as personal properties are really very important at all. Everything's happening at the subpersonal level. I mean, this is the whole predictive coding thing, right?
Yeah,
I mean, really, the stuff at the personal level is kind of drops out of the picture on Andy's view. But he still uses the word belief. And maybe that's true, but in that case, like a lot of what we're doing, and this might be a moral of your book, actually, a lot of what we're doing is kind of empty. It's like we're trying to give an account of something which is happening at the personal level, and really all the work is everything's happening over somewhere else. But for me, I think it really comes down to whether or not you think that believers and knowers is, to use this Salesian phrase, to be that kind of agent is to be someone who occupies the space of reasons. And that's what's built in, that's caked into it's baked into the very notion. And so then everything is happening at the personal level. And you have a very different picture now. The subpersonal stuff, that's kind of might be, upstream or something. But really, what we're doing as epistemologists is giving account of something downstream. You've got these devices being fitted or whatever, and then things happen. And then over time, what kind of modifications does it relate? How does it relate to the persons at that level? And I think, that's where I think, to be a believer at all, to be a knower at all, is already to be, reasons responsive and so forth. And so that's where all the work, as it were, kicks in. But it's a real, there's real, I think there's people are talking past a lot of each other here, because people have radically different pictures of how to think about, in this case, belief, right, and its role in knowledge.
Just a real quick follow-up to that. So I was wondering what you think about this. So this is meant to address the sort of your suggestion that implanting, right, just sort of implanting a belief, whatever, there's something sort of incoherent about the idea of implanting a knowledge app belief, or in a genuine belief of the sort that epistemologists are interested in, right? What do you think about this case? So this is the kind of case that led me to think that, why not, right? So suppose that I do to you what some folks, I guess in 2000, this Ramirez study, what they did to mice. This would be very unethical if we did this. But suppose we implant sort of a memory trace, right, into your head. And it's fake, it's grown. Actually, this is a term I got from one of Sven's book. Suppose the memory trace is grown in vitro and then sort of implanted into your head. And now you're trying to remember, what did that building that you went by the other day look like? And then, you consult your memory, and there's this implanted one in there with all the genuine memory traces. And you're like, it's red, right? You endorse the sort of memory trace that's sort of stored in memory. After you've endorsed it, it looks like the conditions for you having at least a dispositional belief seem to be in place, right? So I'll attribute to you a dispositional belief of the sort that's in the market for knowledge, provided and then the condition is something like this. You have the content stored in memory storage, right? And you're disposed to affirm that content in the appropriate circumstances or something like that. If that's all that's required for the kind of dispositional belief that then is in the market for knowledge, it looks like you could potentially have that in a case where I just, chuck an implant in you and then you retrieve it. So I wonder what you think about that case.
So I think that part of what's clever about technology when it's done, this kind of technology, when it's done beautifully, is that it's seamless, and the subject, it's already kind of, this is what Andy says, like, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for ways of making this, it's seamless. So, like you can have like sort of memory traces come in, but they're kind of clunky and they sort of jar, and the subject kind of think, what the hell's that? And they, so they kind of wear their externality on their sleeve. The interesting cases, like you say, the ones that don't have that. But what would it take for them not to have that? Well, you'd have to know quite a lot about the subject, it seems to me. You have to know quite a lot about what they believe already. And then you have to manipulate the memory trace such that it starts to feel like it's one of theirs, such that they can take ownership of it. And I think that's, one way of thinking about what's going on there is that you're engineering this to make it such that it's easy for the subject to integrate. And I guess I'd bite the bullet on that. I think that is possible. But even there, I think you're making it something. So as long as external comes in, it doesn't immediately become beliefs, right? You're engineering it such that it's the kind of thing that can very quickly become beliefs. But it isn't like you just insert. I think even then I would want to say, I don't want to resist the idea you've inserted a belief. You've inserted a process, and you've done it in such a clever way that it will then quite quickly become a belief, quite quickly become integrated, and so on. I think that's what I'd want to say. Now you might say
that's super interesting.
Yeah. Now, of course, you might say, well, but does it really? If we've done really quickly, does it really matter? But I think it does matter, actually, because it matters to how we frame the discussion. Are we thinking of this? Whether we think this already came in as a chaotic belief, or whether it came in a chaotic belief. Right, because on the one view, it's sort of built into what it is to be a believer, that it has certain conditions. On the other view, it's something where conditions have to be added. So I think it's how we think about the metaphysics of knowledge, and how we think about, what knowledge is and what it is to stand in the space of reasons. It's a very different picture.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And I think Nikolaj is up for the last comment.
All right, let me just go ahead and share my screen. All right, so thanks for the invitation to be a commentator on Adam's book. Well, as the other commentators have said, it's a great book. It's a very good read. Now, I'm gonna simply grant Adam everything he says in the book. And then I want to sort of think about issues that kind of lie downstream from there. In particular, whether there's certain things he doesn't talk about explicitly that he might be committed to, or what his take is on certain issues that I think are left open by what he says. And to focus my comments, I will just simply talk about chapter 5, the chapter on value, the value problem, which Adam summarized earlier. Now, so let me just jump down a bit in the handout. So as Adam has already mentioned, the value problem, as it's been discussed in epistemology, is basically this task of accounting for how knowledge has greater value than any proper subset of its parts, right? So if you're sort of thinking along the lines of justified true belief plus an anti-Gettier condition, well, then the task is to account for how, when you have all of these 4 things put together, how does that have greater value than any sort of proper subset of those 4 things? Now, Adam, he wants to add an autonomy condition. So within that framework, the task becomes to sort of show that knowledge has greater value than any proper subset of those 5 things put together. Justification, truth, autonomy, belief, and an anti-Gettier condition. And in particular for Adam, given the focus of his book, it's especially pressing that he says something about what is the value of autonomy? What does it add to the picture? Right. So let me just very briefly introduce a couple of distinctions regarding value that will be relevant to what I'm going to say and what Adam says. So first, there is a distinction between fundamental or non-derivative value and non-fundamental or derivative value. It sort of says that distinction speaks to, in some sense, a sort of hierarchy of value or a sort of ordering of values. There's also a distinction between instrumental versus non-instrumental or final value. Or in Adam's discussion, he simply treats non-instrumental value as final value, and it says something about how we value things, whether we value them for their own sake, which is final value, or whether we merely value them as a means to an end, which is instrumental value. I also put intrinsic versus extrinsic value, but I think we can leave it out for now. Now, in relation to the value problem, this idea of certain epistemic goods swamping other goods has played a very central role. In particular, if you take a view like what's often referred to as veritism, a certain kind of monism about epistemic value, namely the view that the only fundamental and non-derivative good there is true belief, right? So if you take that view and you pair it with the view that any other goods there are, epistemic goods there are, they simply have instrumental value. They merely have a value in virtue of being sort of instruments for reaching the sole epistemic good truth, right? Or the sole fundamental epistemic good truth. So if you combine these two views, right, it's very easy to get into this predicament, namely that you get a kind of swamping, right? So if you look at the other, like the different conditions involved in knowledge, right, it's different to see how the value of knowledge could exceed the value of mere true belief, right? Because if true belief is the only fundamental non-derivative good that's around, and any other epistemic good are merely instruments to that fundamental epistemic good, you might think that the value of these other epistemic goods gets swamped by truth. So that basically, that when they're present, if truth is also there, no additional value is realized, right? Now, there's a very nice paper by Kurt Sylvan, which Adam also mentioned, where he says, look, Veritas, they should switch their focus. They should switch strategy. So what he wants to carve out space for is to say that there are certain non-instrumental values that are nonetheless derivative, right? So he buys into a kind of non-instrumentalism and uses that to get around swamping. So there's a kind of swamping he thinks that you don't get within the framework that he's interested in exploring, namely that in particular, right, if you can say that truth is the only non-derivative epistemic good, and say that anything else derives its value from it, but still you can have additional value added, right? In particular, you can have final value added by goods that derive their value from truth, right? So that's the kind of position he wants to argue for, and I'm going to give you some examples that he uses to motivate this kind of position, right? So in the handout, there are two examples. One called beneficence. So if you think about beneficent actions, right? So consider a case where Alice and Beatrice, they both perform beneficent actions or acts. But now suppose that Alice, she does this because she really cares about beneficence, right? But Beatrice, she does it to cultivate a good public image. Now, in this case, both acts, they realize a certain non-instrumental final value, and also a non-derivative fundamental value, namely beneficence. But now, there's a difference when it comes to what sort of the further things you might say about the value, right? So in Alice's case, she values beneficence. She cares about beneficence. So she has what's called a fitting attitude towards that particular non-derivative fundamental good. So that, according to Sylvan, means that Alice's acts also, in virtue of that fitting attitude, realizes some additional final value. It's derivative, but nonetheless, there's some additional final value, something that's valuable for its own sake, right? Now, so you can get an epistemic analog of this, and this is a case that Adam puts forward and also discusses. So suppose that there are these two guys, Adam and Nikolaj. Adam has a true belief that manifests a fitting way of valuing truth, respect for truth. This is Sylvan's notion or expression. So maybe he's very careful in the way he's sort of arrived at this belief. He's investigated carefully, accumulated lots of evidence, and so on, right? So he's taken great intellectual care, as you might put it, right, in arriving at the belief. Then there's Nikolaj. He has the same true belief, but he's been very negligent, very sloppy, right? So in this case, you might think that both beliefs, they realize the non-derivative fundamental value of truth or true belief, but there still seems to be a difference, right? So just as in the case of beneficence, the case considered before, one agent seems to have a fitting attitude towards the non-derivative fundamental good, right? That's relevant. So in this case, Adam has a fitting attitude towards the non-derivative fundamental good of truth, right? Because he cares about it. He's taking great care in his investigation or in acquiring the belief that he holds, right? In that sense, respects truth. So according to Sylvan, that means that you get some additional final non-instrumental value in that case, right? But that is absent in the case of Nikolaj's belief, because there's no respect for truth in that case, right? So that's what Sylvan he proposes, and that is basically a way I think for the veritists to deal with the swamping problem. So it's within this sort of monist framework. There's a kind of monism about fundamental non-derivative epistemic goods. There's just truth, right? But within that framework, there's some moves you can make to deal with the swamping problem. Now, as I read Adam, he thinks that the fitting attitudes approach is not the path to take. And essentially, what he says is that fitting attitudes can be engineered, right? So in the beneficence case, so consider beneficence star. So it's like beneficence, the previous case we considered with Alice and Beatrice. But there's this third character, Kurt. He realizes, right, that Beatrice's beneficent acts is not motivated in the right kind of way, right? So Kurt hires this team of psychologists and brainwashers to study Alice, right, who has the right kind of motivational setup, and they map that, and then they implement it into Beatrice's psychology. So at the end of this process, Alice and Beatrice, they're basically psychological twins. Now, from that point onwards, when Beatrice acts in a beneficent way, the fitting attitude will be there, just like in Alice's case, because they have this, now they have the same motivational psychological setup, right? But according to Adam, it doesn't seem like Beatrice's act has the same kind of value as Alice's still, right? Even with the fitting attitudes in place. And it is because in Beatrice's case, the fitting attitude is engineered in a certain way, right? And you can also run an epistemic analog of this, right? So, so consider the true belief case again, and then, modify it a bit. So, Duncan realizes that my true beliefs, they come about in a negligent way, in a sloppy way, right? So he hires a team of people to study Adam's cognitive setup and his psychology, and then basically turns me into an epistemic twin of Adam. So from that point onwards, when I have true beliefs, of this character called Nikolaj, I guess we can't assume it's me, but anyway, when Nikolaj has true beliefs from that point onwards, the fitting attitude is also there, just like in Adam's case, right? A respect for truth is realized. But Adam says, in that case, still, it seems like Nikolaj's true beliefs do not have the same kind of value as that of Adam's, right? And again, it's because the fitting attitude is kind of engineered. So I think that's Adam's reason for discarding the sort of fitting attitudes approach suggested by Sylvan, and surprise, surprise, he wheels in autonomy instead. So let me now briefly summarize what it says about autonomy and how it can account for additional final value in the case of knowledge. Okay, so he draws some inspiration from Karsgaard and what she says about action and the self. So basically, she takes autonomous action to be self-constituting, or they're sort of part of what makes yourself or constitute yourself, right? And non-autonomous, it's autonomous action. They don't play that role, right? They don't constitute the self in the same way. Now, take self-constitution to be finally a non-instrumentally valuable, right? And also, I think, non-derivative or fundamentally valuable. I think now, autonomous action, you might, on this kind of view, you can take that to be finally and non-instrumentally valuable, simply because it contributes towards self-constitution. So I think autonomous action within this kind of framework will come out as a derivative value or a derivative good, but it nonetheless has final value, right? And it so Adam's move is to transpose this idea to the case of belief and self, right? So basically, autonomous beliefs are constitutive of the intellectual self, right? And autonomous beliefs are, in a sort of substantial sense, ours, right? Whereas non-autonomous beliefs or heteronymous beliefs, they're not. They don't constitute the intellectual self in the same way. And as far as value is concerned, you get this sort of same kind of picture, right? So intellectual self-constitution is finally and fundamentally, that is non-derivatively valuable. And then you have autonomous belief that is derivatively valuable, derives its value from its relation to intellectual self-constitution, but nonetheless, it can have final value, right? And that's basically how I think Adam deals with the value problem. But that's what you get from autonomy, extra final value. Okay, so that was sort of a summary of what he says about a value theory and the value problem. And then I want to sort of lay out a few issues quite quickly and ask him what he thinks about that. All right. So as already mentioned, I read Sylvan as being a monist. He's a monist about fundamental non-derivative value. There's just one good of that kind in the true belief, right? But I think that Adam, he's committed to pluralism about fundamental or non-derivative value. So I don't think he wants to reject the idea that true belief is a good of that kind or a value of that kind. But I do think that he also wants to add intellectual self-constitution as a separate fundamental and non-derivative epistemic good. And I gather that this is the case because he's very keen to emphasize that it sort of plays a role in making beliefs ours, or and that seems to be something that's just like separate from truth, I think. This idea of sort of, in some sense, ownership of beliefs and our own intellectual selves. Okay, so that's why I think Adam is a pluralist about non-derivative or fundamental epistemic goods. And I want to note this because it's not mentioned explicitly or discussed explicitly in the book, right? But it is this kind of thesis, pluralism about this fundamental and non-derivative epistemic goods. It's a quite substantial thesis, right? And certainly a thesis that's not that widely held, right? So I think it's worth putting out there, and I'm kind of curious to see if I got that right. Now there's a related issue regarding value comparisons, right? So of course, given what I've just said about the value problem, what Adam says about that, he can sort of account for why it is that when you have knowledge, why it has greater value than its sort of any proper subset of its parts or components, right? Given if we grant him the story about autonomy, right? But there are other, and that kind of comparison works, right? Because when you have knowledge, it ticks all the boxes, so to speak, right? But when you have some proper subset of it, there's some box that's not ticked, right? But I'm wondering about less elaborate cases, so to speak. So consider two beliefs: one that's true but non-autonomous or heteronymous, right? And a belief that's false but autonomous. So in that case, what you get, if I'm right about the pluralism, right, is that you get one of the fundamental non-derivative goods is realized by the first belief, and the second belief realizes the other one, right? So then I'm curious, which belief possesses greater epistemic value? Are the two fundamental non-derivative values incomparable? That's the kind of view you can have if you're pluralist, of the sort that I think Adam is, or are they somehow comparable? And if so, what makes them comparable? And depending on what Adam says in response to those questions, I may have some follow-ups or some further things to say. Now, there's also, the next thing I want to talk about is if his view is committed to a certain kind of fragmentation in the mental lives of subjects, assuming that they have at least some non-autonomous beliefs, right? So I take it that all beliefs of a subject are part of the person's or the subject's mental life, right? But the autonomous beliefs, they'll be sort of reflective or constitutive of the intellectual self of the subject, right? But the non-autonomous, heteronymous beliefs won't be sort of constitutive of the intellectual self of the subject, right? So there is this kind of fragmentation, I think, in the mental life of subjects, right? If what Adam says is right. Now, and this is, although I think that probably, I mean, if I remember correctly, in the kinds of cases that Adam considers, probably, you know, all beliefs will connect in the right kind of ways with action. Like, so the subjects won't, for example, hesitate to act on their beliefs, right? Whether they're autonomous or not, given appropriate desires and goals, right? So there is that kind of integration, or that's in that respect, they seem on a par. But nonetheless, I think there is this kind of fragmentation in a certain sense in the mental lives of subjects. Now, I think the sort of extreme or the limit case of this, right, is if you imagine sort of again, granting sort of Adam the kinds of cases he wants to consider. You know, if you consider a case where all beliefs are implanted, right, or somehow linked up with some kind of technology, right? In that sense, an essential part of the intellectual self, that the one that's constituted by beliefs, will be completely absent, because non-autonomous beliefs can't constitute the intellectual self, right? So that they can, in some sense, maybe within the kind of framework Adam has, be sort of intellectually selfless subjects, I think, in the limit case, right? Now, the last point I want to make pertains to the relationship between belief and action and agency. So throughout the book, Adam, he spends a lot of time, I think, drawing sort of on the literature on action theory, agency, and moral responsibility, and he sort of uses it to shed light on epistemology. And also, you know, yeah, and in the case of Korsgaard, right, he has this sort of he runs sort of what she says about action, right, in parallel with what he says about belief. Now, but I'm kind of curious if what he says about belief, whether it can sort of connect back to action and agency, right? So a lot of people, they buy into a kind of belief, desire kind of action, right? You get action when you combine beliefs with desires. Now, as said earlier, I think in the kinds of cases that Adam he's interested in, beliefs, whether they're autonomous or not, will kind of connect with desires and produce action, right? But if only autonomous beliefs, right, they're constitutive of the intellectual self, and they're the only beliefs that are truly ours, right? Within this sort of belief, desire, action framework, maybe there is a sense in which belief, the issue about autonomous, non-autonomous beliefs, impacts the status of action and agency, right? Because when you act on a non-autonomous belief, a belief that's not constitutive of the subject's intellectual self, you may think that also, I mean, that the action that results is not expressive of the subject's agency in the same way that you would get if you had the same action produced or brought about on the basis of an autonomous belief. So I think that maybe there is potentially sort of a way that what Adam says connects back to action and agency. And yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Nikolaj. Thank you. Adam, you want to give a response to Nikolaj?
Yeah, first off, Nikolaj, that was fantastic. I really appreciate you going through chapter 5 so carefully. I want to tell you that you got me exactly right. So nothing you said about my view was uncharitable in any way. You characterized the whole thing nicely. It's it's interesting to see, first off, I'll deal with the pluralism comment. So I never actually even considered that when writing the chapter, whether I'm a pluralist about fundamental value, fundamental epistemic value or not. And the more I listen to you lay it out, I suppose I think I am in one sense, but what I want to try to do is kind of briefly clarify the sense in which I take it that I'm a pluralist, and then maybe you can tell me if you think I can even get away with saying this. So to start out, I've always thought of, or have at least been lately and while writing this book, thinking about pluralism about epistemic value in a way that's broadly kind of similar to the way we might think of Sosa as a pluralist about epistemic value, but not really. So here's what I mean by that. So Sosa thinks, right, that there's, our attempts, our beliefs, our attempts, they can be evaluated in a certain way. And there's a certain kind of normativity that applies to our beliefs that we in fact have. And there's a separate kind of domain. Now, Sosa describes this as like two sides of epistemology. I think that sounds right. Whether or not the second domain is an epistemic domain, a different kind of epistemic domain, or a non-epistemic ethical domain, I'm not sure, but Sosa will describe this entirely different set of norms, not the AAA, accurate adroit apt norms that apply to our attempts, but rather norms of intellectual ethics broadly construed, right? And norms of intellectual ethics will regulate, importantly, what count as the good inquiries to take up in the first place. Accuracy, aptness, and adroitness don't tell us anything about that, right? Norms of intellectual ethics will tell us how to best sustain certain inquiries, and this imports certain ethical and non-epistemic considerations, such as our finite time, right? Norms of good intellectual ethics will say that you shouldn't spend your whole life counting sand, even if you always count sand knowledgeably, right? Because this is sort of a bad epistemic choice, all things considered in your broader life. So I'm sympathetic to the idea that Sosa is just right about this, that there's one type of normativity that is applicable to the beliefs that we in fact make, the attempts at knowing that we in fact make, and then there's another type that governs our wider intellectual lives. Now, how that type of two-pronged picture of value in epistemology maps onto what I say about the value of knowledge, here's my best attempt to sort of explain how I would think about that. And although I didn't mention that in the book, obviously, and again, you got me exactly right, that I think that, yeah, autonomous knowledge gets an extra boost of value in the same way that something that, something that is sort of connected to, sort of has relational properties in virtue of which it's connected to something that's non-instrumentally valuable, has final value, right? We think that Diana's dress has value, that's final value, that an intrinsic duplicate doesn't have because of its relational properties. Of course, as you got me right, my move is that knowledge, in virtue of requiring autonomous belief, something that satisfies these certain conditions I said, is going to have relational properties to this intellectually valuable thing, this which is our intellectual self-constitution. Autonomous knowledge contributes to this valuable thing, and so bears that relational property, Diana to the dress style, whereas heteronymous belief doesn't have this relational property to this valuable thing, which is our intellectual self-constitution. So therein lies the extra boost, and you're absolutely right to say it's an extra final value boost. Now, the source of that normativity that explains the extra value boost, I'd have to say that comes from intellectual ethics, right? So intellectual self-constitution seems to be a kind of good that falls within the remit if we go with the Sosa sort of dichotomy between, like telic normativity that applies to our attempts and broader normativity that applies to intellectual ethics. The good of intellectual constitution seems to fall onto the intellectual ethics side of things. And if that's right, then I have a sort of a strange position then where this extra boost of value that applies to knowing, even though knowledge is sort of within a constrained bit of value, like I would think of knowledge as sort of falling within telic evaluation. There's this extra little boost that kind of gets its source from intellectual ethics. That is how I view things. So I think that if that makes me a pluralist about fundamental epistemic value, then I think I have to agree with you that I'm a pluralist in the sense that those two claims that you give, belief one, true but heteronymous, and false but autonomous, I have to go with the incommensurable line, I think, because there's different value domains at play here. One of them is better with respect to intellectual constitution, self-constitution, which is good with reference to norms that govern good intellectual ethics. And one is good with reference to sort of gnoseology or knowledge-related norms. So I would think those two are incomparable. But it's interesting to think I never considered whether I was a value monist or pluralist in light of what I've said until you pressed me on it. But that's at least what I'd want to say to that. Before I go on to respond to your other comments, I wondered if you think that what I've said actually makes sense, whether or not that can work. It is a bit of a weird view.
Yeah, so I think maybe, I mean, I wasn't quite sure how, because you used the locution domain, or sometimes you also talk about maybe point of view or something like that. And maybe now the way you put it, it could sort of track different kinds of normativity in the sense thought of by Sosa. And that wasn't sort of, I mean, first I thought that just of domain or point of view is something like epistemic point of view, or, and I thought that would sort of be the broadest possible category in some sense, almost, and would include all the kind of things that maybe, the different kinds of normativity that Sosa talks about. So I guess, so that's what I thought, right, when you said that. But I'm still, about the issue about fundamental or non-derivative values. I guess, so I guess that the way that non-derivative is used, or derivative, it's sort of a quite broad notion, like that could sort of capture different kinds of dependence or, grounding, or, but yeah, at least in my mind, I haven't yet sort of at least completely been able to make a case for why it should be derivative. Like if you want to be a monist, like a veritist, right?
No, I agree. I think that's right. I think nothing that was in the book actually gives any hint as to how I would be a monist. So I think that based on at least the way I presented in the book, I think probably the right way to read me is as a pluralist who didn't explain himself as to why he's signing up for pluralism. The Sosa stuff, by the way, is just my considered thought now that you've raised it. I think if I were to have redone the chapter, I might have tried to fit some of that in to explain better the sense in which I take myself to be a pluralist. But at least based on the reading of the book, I think it's fair enough to say that view that's in the book looks to be probably committed to a form of pluralism, which would then have required a little bit more explanation, I think. Regarding the bit about fragmentation, it's funny that you mentioned that case. I think I'll just bite the bullet on the limit case and say that, in a case where you're completely brainwashed, there's an important sense in which we use the notion of a self that is a self that then, as on the course guard line, becomes constituted by our autonomous moves, both moral and intellectual, where we're simply lacking this, where this is absent in a case where you are completely brainwashed. So I'll bite the bullet in the limit case. The final point about the applicability of some of the moves made more widely in discussions of action and agency. So one question is, so if I'm right that knowledge requires autonomous belief that's specified in a certain sense, we can ask, in what way does that matter for discussions of moral responsibility and agency? I haven't really traced this out yet. I think that would be a separate project, and it's one that I plan to think about. So if I'm right about the epistemology angle, what import does this have for views about that connect knowledge to intentional action and such things? But the comment that I wanted to give in response to your question about how my line relates to stuff on agency and action, is that I noticed a disanalogy early on when I was drawing from some of these fun discussions over in the manipulation and moral responsibility literature and trying to sort of import these over to epistemology. I noticed a case that struck me as importantly disanalogous. And the way I was thinking about this is always that there is a really important disanalogy between the two discussions. And this analogy can be drawn out in what they call self-arrangement cases and the moral responsibility literature. So there's a sense in which if you drink 10 tequilas or whatever and then get behind the wheel, there's a sense in which you seem to lack any control over what you're doing. Questions of moral responsibility then seem to turn importantly on how you came to, whether or not you self-arranged to be in the state or not, right? If somebody spiked your drinks, I guess it would be difficult to do that with 10 tequilas without noticing. But suppose if someone gave you a shot or some sort of a shot full of alcohol to the bloodstream, and now you're caused to have this intoxication, and now you're placed behind a wheel, and then you cause a wreck. We say, you're not morally responsible for lacking this control at the time because you didn't do anything to then put yourself into that position. Our intuition about moral responsibility seems very, very different if it turns out that at a previous time you chose to drink the 10 tequilas or whatever, and then get behind the wheel. We say, yeah, you're not, there's a sense in which you lack any ability to control anything at time 2, but you made the choice at time 1. You self-arranged that you would be incapacitated at time 2, and that matters. What I noticed that's interesting is that there isn't an analog to that, in my opinion, at least the way I think about it, in the epistemic case. And that made me start to think from the very beginning that there's this important disanalogy between the type of autonomy, the type of attitudinal autonomy that matters for moral responsibility and the type of attitudinal autonomy that matters for knowledge. So here's the idea. Take two versions of a true temp case. One where true temp is caused to have the thermometer, against true temp's will. That's case 1. And now true temp sort of compulsively forms all these beliefs about the ambient temperature. Case 2, true temp heard that you could go to, I guess this is American, go to Walmart and buy a true temp, and true temp does that and sort of then inserts this, and then it has all the same results. The tempucomp then, I guess to make the analogy exactly clear, suppose it then wipes away his memory that he ever did this. So it's actually structurally similar, that later on true temp doesn't understand that he has this thing in his head and compulsively forms beliefs about the ambient temperature. A question is, does the fact that true temp sort of self-arranged that he would have the tempucomp installed at an earlier point, does that matter one whit when asking whether or not true temp now at time 2 has the kind of epistemic autonomy that matters for knowledge? My thought is that no, he's going to lack the kind of epistemic autonomy that matters at time 2, provided he fails the bypass and unsheddability conditions, regardless of whether he arranged the tempucomp or not. So that seems very different from what we think of in the moral responsibility case, where it seems like self-arrangement really matters. I mention that just because that's an interesting case in which I think there's an important disanalogy between the kind of attitudinal autonomy that matters for moral responsibility, to which self-arrangement is super important, and the kind of attitudinal autonomy that matters for knowledge, which is such that self-arrangement doesn't matter. So I mentioned that because that's kind of a disanalogy that guided some of my thinking throughout. I'll leave there.
Well, maybe a quick follow-up, although I think maybe I'm out of time because I think my comments went way over the time. So what I had in mind with the connection between belief and action wasn't necessarily how analogous they might be or disanalogous. It was more if you're right in the belief case, whether it spills over to the case of action. And when you have things that are not autonomous in the belief case because of the crucial role that belief plays in action explanations, whether you get something like a decrease in agency or the practical self, so to speak, right. On the action side. So that was the idea, because
Oh, right, of course.
So a lot of people do
Yeah.
buy into some version of this sort of belief, desire, action kind of framework, right? And where we act on our beliefs combined with desires, something like that, right? So if you have within that model, if you have non-autonomous beliefs that don't sort of constitute your intellectual self, maybe you think that if our agency and our sort of practical self, right, is constituted by our actions, if they're explained by a non-autonomous belief, maybe they're also less, expressive of our practical self, or there's a lower degree of agency or something like that. That was the.
Oh, okay, good. I think that's both plausible, and I think I'm probably just committed to countenancing that would be the case. So on the one hand, I think that it would be very odd if I defended the view that I defended, but then wouldn't make the extension that you just described. But the good news is I think that the extension that you just described sounds very plausible. If you buy into some of the Korsgaard self-constitution stuff discussed in chapter 5, if that strikes one as plausible, which I sort of built my view in chapter 5 out of, then I think the type of extension that you just described would seem like just what you should expect. So I think that I would give that the thumbs up and say I would sign up to that implication.
All right.
So thank you everyone for your valuable contributions, and thank you, Adam, for giving us the chance to comment on your book. And for our viewers, if you want to participate and leave us a comment, you can use the comment section below. And if you want to stay tuned on the next episode of Philosopher Meets Critics or other events by Concept, you may want to visit our website, which I will also link below. And to wrap this up, I just want to say thank you and take care, everyone. Have a nice day or good night, depending on where you are. And see you soon. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. It's been really helpful. Thank you.